The next panel starts now.
أرحب بالجميع
The next
في هذه
panel
الجلسة.
starts now.
وقبل أن نبدأ بودي أن أتقدم بالشكر لدكتور ابتسام ولفريق العمل لتنظيم هذا المنتدى السنوي المفيد. أعتقد خلال الجلسات السابقة يعني تشبعنا سياسة، والآن نتحول إلى مجال آخر، إلى العوامل المؤثرة على السياسة: التقنية، الطاقة، العوامل الجيواقتصادية. لذلك هذه الجلسة سوف تكون مختلفة لتناولها مواضيع أيضاً متعددة، مثل ما ذكرت تكنولوجيا الطاقة والتغيرات الجيواقتصادية، وأيضاً مختلفة في نوعية المتحدثين. أثناء التحضير جلست مع المتحدثين ووجدت بأن بينهم العالم، وبينهم المتخصص في الطاقة، وبينهم الصحفي المعروف جيداً، وبالأخص لمن يقرأ الفاينانشال تايمز. لذلك عملية التحضير كانت على الأقل مفيدة بالنسبة لي. باختصار هذه الجلسة سوف تتناول سوق الطاقة العالمي، وكيف يمكن تحديد اتجاهات الطاقة الجارية والناشئة، ما نقاط القوة، التحديات التي تفرزها هذه الاتجاهات، كيف يمكن للدول استمرار في تلبية متطلبات الثلاثة اللي هي الطاقة، القدرة، وعملية الاستدامة، ما المسارات المحتملة لسوق الطاقة العالمي. لذلك سوف أبدأ مع الدكتور هاني، وهو عالم ومتخصص في التقنيات التي لها علاقة بالتغيرات في سوق الطاقة وبعوامل أخرى. أعتقد أنها ستكون مفيدة. هناك بعض التساؤلات دكتور هاني: ما هي العوامل التي تؤثر على الاقتصاد، وما هي التأثيرات بالتالي الاقتصادية التي تؤثر محلياً وعالمياً بشكل عام نتيجة للتغيرات الجارية. تفضل دكتور.
شكراً جزيلاً. If you don't mind, I will speak in English. Thanks, Dr. Mohammed, for the introduction, and I want to add my voice to those who thank Dr. Ibtisam and congratulate her and her staff for a wonderful hospitality and great organization. This forum has been most informative, which I judge by how much I learn by listening to the speakers and to the questions. I should start with a full disclosure that I'm not an energy expert. As Dr. Mohammed said, I am more a student of the impact of technology on the economics and the geoeconomics of the countries and of the world. So the energy sector, as the title of this session states, global geoeconomic shifts, the troubled energy market gets it right. The energy market is in trouble. It's one that has witnessed the most transformative change in over a century. That change has been disruptive, as it has been in other sectors, as we have witnessed in retailing and distribution, in media and information, communication, photography, and on and on and on. Now it's hit the energy market squarely, and that change is irreversible. It has very serious and important consequences, not only for the region, but also for the geopolitical shifts that are taking place in the world. To give you a sense of how the energy sector has been transformed, in the 1970s, when energy was strongly in demand, where most geopolitical decisions of the big powers were focused on energy and securing access to energy, Energy sector represented about 22 to 23% of the US GDP. It's currently 6%. In the last 10 years and 12 years alone, the increase in production of US energy, particularly oil, has been over 5 million barrels, which equals to the entire output, daily output of all GCC countries with the exception of Saudi Arabia. That has made US less energy dependent on imports. It has also, because of a whole range of technologies that not only impacted the way we produce, what we produce, but also the way we consume and what we consume. Over the next 15 to 20 years, next 2 decades, all projections, energy projections, show a flat to a decline in overall use of energy in the industrialized countries of the world, and only growth that is likely to take place over the next decade or so will be from developing countries. And just to give you a sense of what's happened in the United States, which is the largest per capita energy consumer, over the course of the last 20 years, since the beginning of this century, we have been reducing our per capita consumption at the rate of about 1 to 1.1% per year. So today we are consuming 20% less energy than we have in the past.
شكرا دكتور هاني. ما ذكرته مهم، ولكن يعني لدي سؤال. تعتقد كيف تستجيب يعني المنطقة لهذه التغيرات التي ذكرتها ولبعضها، يعني ما أهميتها انعكاساتها على المنطقة؟
So this region has for a long time speaking about the potential for diversification of its economy away from energy, but it has not been backed by action, or most of the action that have taken place, as we all know, have been very marginal and has continued to keep the impact of energy on its economy to be very high. And in some countries, it represents 80 to 85% of the entire government revenues. In terms of the overall GDP impact, it's at least 60 to 70%. So the region continues to be dependent on energy. Some countries have taken steps, at least for the last few years, to diversify its economy. The Saudi Vision 2030 and similar kind of plans that have taken place have recognized that energy, as we know it, will not be in demand as much as it has been over the last 25, 50 years. And have taken some steps to doing that. Regardless of whether these steps are adequate or correct, it is a recognition that the region is taking place. Here in the UAE, Abu Dhabi has been actually very prescient about the energy sector. It has set up an organization with my old alma mater, MIT, to set up the Master project, which is a project for renewable energy, recognizing that there's going to be a whole range of new technology that uses energy. So there's been pretty steady steps. They are still very small at this point, but hopefully they will accelerate because the time that the region has for demand for energy and the price of energy is fairly limited, and I would say it's 10 to 20 years.
شكرا دكتور. هناك أسئلة أخرى ولكن نؤجلها إلى فيما بعد. يعني انتقل للمتحدث الثاني الدكتور مراد، وهو متخصص أيضا في شؤون الطاقة. دكتور، يعني كيف تنظر إلى أسواق الطاقة العالمية الآن في الوقت الحاضر، وما هي أبرز التحديات؟ يعني هذا موضوع التحديات يهمنا نحن في دول الخليج التي تواجه سوق الطاقة العالمي يعني في الوقت الحاضر. تفضل.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be back here in Abu Dhabi. I tend to visit a couple of times a year, and special thanks to Dr. Abdullah, she just popped out, but always a very warm reception when I do come to this particular gathering. It's my second time here. Let me make some remarks sort of directed towards a kind of global level, let's say, in trying to give you some kind of a description, brief description of what characterizes the global energy landscape at present. And I should also qualify my comments in the sense that I've been working for the past 7 years or so for an international treaty on energy investments called the Energy Charter Treaty. Some of you may have or may have not heard about it, but we have 55 member countries, mostly in Europe, Eurasia, spanning across towards Japan and Australia, and the treaty's about energy investments, protection of energy investments. It's a legal regime for investments. So I tend to work with governments. I tend to travel quite a lot to different parts of the world, energy sort of consuming regions, energy producing regions, certainly dynamic regions in terms of energy investments. So let me just try to give you a short sort of synopsis of what I see as some of the key characteristics of the global energy landscape at present, and then maybe I can come to the question of some of the key challenges. They're very interrelated, by the way. So first comment I want to make in terms of the characteristics of the energy landscape at a global level, and I think it's an important point to make when one addresses a gathering of kind of foreign policy practitioners, experts in the sphere of foreign policy. We gathered here, of course, not just to look at energy, but to look at the international relations environment. So first point is that the debates about energy security and the whole sort of global discussion about energy security is maybe less acute than it was maybe 10 years ago. 10 years ago and slightly earlier, we were in a period of very high oil price environment. In July 2008, the oil price reached around about $144, I think, per barrel, which was really taking us into record highs. And this created a lot of tensions at a political level between so-called energy-producing countries and energy-consuming countries. There seemed to be a lot of concern, certainly in the European Union, US, that this very high oil price environment is not healthy for the global economy. It's not healthy for other sectors of the economy which are very reliant on energy for their various production and service-oriented, let's say, trends. So we've moved well away from that environment. We're no longer in this very high oil price environment today, and we don't really tend to have such a strong narrative about producers versus consumers. My colleague here sort of mentioned that, in fact, this panel is framed as kind of a troubled energy market, but from an energy security standpoint, I'm not sure to what degree we are in a troubled energy market landscape. When I first came to Brussels 10 years ago, it was the height of the kind of Russia, Ukraine, EU gas supply disruptions. And gas supply security very much overtook the oil supply security sort of narrative as a key sort of policy concern for European decision makers, Brussels decision makers. We're all concerned about Russia as a source of the gas supply, and this created a lot of tension within Europe. It was kind of a wake-up call for Europe to instigate a lot of policy measures, such as building up an internal energy market and promoting this idea, quite a loose idea, of kind of energy solidarity. But the kind of end result there is that we're today not in this strident energy security sort of debate that we were 10 years ago. And that leads me into the second point, which is directly related to the first, sort of why we're not in this harsh, why we're not in this more strident energy security, why the tensions with energy security sort of eased. And I would argue that this is because of the sort of game-changing phenomena of the so-called shale revolution in the United States. Okay, so around about 2010, we start seeing United States overtaking Russia as the world's largest gas producer, although it's kind of neck and neck in terms of figures if you look at them more closely. But the wider impact of the shale revolution in the US is that actually US has been importing substantially less oil than it was in the past. I don't recall the figures at the moment, but I mean roughly the US is importing around about 50% less oil than it was 12, 13, 14 years ago. Someone could correct me if the figures are not exactly right, but this has a big impact on the oil price environment overall. So we've gone from a sort of situation where oil price was high, this had knock-on effects onto the gas price, and you know, we've gone into an environment where oil prices are far more manageable from an energy-consuming sort of standpoint. Of course, energy suppliers may have different outlook on this, but today we're in an environment where generally, I was here in January in Abu Dhabi and speaking to the energy minister of the UAE, and his comments, I think he was the president of OPEC this year, the UAE, were that oil market is more or less in moving towards a balanced environment, which is this conservative sort of view that if we have this price range sort of somewhere in the 80s, maybe 60 to 80 sort of dollars per barrel, this is a kind of balanced environment. So, so the sense of energy security has eased because of the shale revolution. This has also had major implications, I think, in the context of production and consumption patterns in energy. So 10 plus years ago, the whole big story was demand growth in Asia, particularly India and China. So if you look at the, let's say, IEA's World Energy Outlook in 2008, it was all about demand growth in Asia, India, and China. This demand has slowed substantially. The environment in which we're in is one that's characterized by a relative abundance of supply of conventional energy. And when I say conventional energy, I'm kind of referring to fossil energy. And of course, there's various, in the last sort of years, new discoveries, particularly in natural gas, which has further eased energy security concerns, certainly in Europe. So that is another characteristic of the market, interrelated to the first. And then another kind of wider characteristic is this whole discussion about energy transition, decarbonization, and climate. So all of these things are very interrelated, and this really, in essence, starts to bring us into what I refer to as the great dilemma of our time. It's no longer about, the discussion is no longer about, security of supply and even, debates about security of supply and demand. We still have to, of course, manage supply and demand, but the bigger discussion of, the environment, how we burn energy, how we emit, the greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere, and how all of these sort of interdynamics play out. This is a great dilemma. In Europe, and in fact I was in China just 2 weeks ago, also in China I would say, we're kind of getting into a situation where governments are now telling us that we recognize that we have a relative abundance of supply of conventional energy. We realize that demand while it is not at its peak, not at the peak levels that it was like 10 years ago or so, but demand is still there, and we still will need to invest much more in terms of satisfying energy demand with primary energy supply. But governments are actually now telling us that we do not want as much investment, and we do not want as much production of conventional fossil energy. And this points us to a great dilemma, because what do we actually replace this supply with? And of course, the whole discussion in Europe and at an international level, and my colleague here, neighbor, mentioned, Masdar, renewable energy is catching on a little bit in this region as well. But, the whole discussion now is about, so how do we increase the volume of renewable energy sources in our national and global level energy balance?
Dr. Marat?
Yeah.
1 minute.
And how do we lessen our carbon footprint? So this is a huge challenge, because we have this abundance of energy supply, but because of climate issues, because of the Paris agreements of late 2015, we can no longer actually utilize all of this abundant energy. We have to be far more cautious now with, with the type of energy that we use. And that has a hell of a lot of knock-on effects onto investment patterns in the energy markets. This is probably one of the big challenges that we're actually facing.
Thank you.
النهارده اليوم today.
شكرا دكتور. هناك طبعا بعض يعني بالتأكيد الأسئلة والملاحظات، وبالأخص حول التغيير في ميزان الطاقة العالمي، يعني انتقال زيادة حصة الغاز وانخفاض حصة النفط. كان بودي أن يعني تبين ما هي انعكاسات هذه التحديات على دول المنطقة، ولكن أؤجل ذلك إلى ما بعد كلمة السيد إدوارد، وهو متخصص يعني صحفي. أعتقد أي حد يقرأ الفاينانشال تايمز لابد أن قرأ لإدوارد بعض المقالات العلمية والتحليلات الجميلة. بودي لو تتحدث إدوارد عن يعني مدى تغلغل الطاقة في المشهد الجيوسياسي في العالم بشكل عام، يعني إذا تعطي فكرة، و يعني المنافسة في سوق الطاقة العالمية إذا ممكن. تفضل.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your panel. Thanks also, echo my co-panelists, thanks to Dr. Abdullah for setting up such a wonderful conference. I've been once before, and you don't disappoint in this gorgeous, cozy boutique hotel that you hold it in. I am not an energy expert either. I mean, that should be double underlined. You are not an energy expert, but you are, in fact, an energy expert, and you are an energy expert. I really am not. So let's just sort of underline that. I want to later on, and I hope we will later on, get into the geopolitics of climate change, because I think that is going to be an increasingly central fact of how the world organizes itself. But let me just start by, if you like, skating geopolitically on some of the energy remarks that both of you have made. And both of you have rightly emphasized that the great energy revolution of the last decade or so is the fracking, shale oil, tar sands, discoveries and new technologies in North America. And that has, as you rightly point out, decreased and in fact eliminated the entire political debate in the United States and elsewhere about energy security and energy independence, because for all intents and purposes, America has energy independence. I know that phrase doesn't make economic sense because we have global spot prices, but for all intents and purposes, America has energy independence, and it also, of course, has, as you pointed out, far greater energy efficiency. It's a far smaller share of the American economy, and it will continue to get smaller. And I think that is a very, very salient fact when you look at, in parallel, over the last 10 years, for one reason or another, from one administration to another, from Obama to Trump, America's gradual withdrawal from the Middle East. And I think this is, we can look at proximate causes for this. We can look at the Obama election in 2008 being to do with disengagement from Iraq, and that's, part of why he became president. We can look at his ambivalent response to the Arab Spring and some of the mixed signals that he sent. We can look at Trump undoing Obama and his withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. But essentially underlying all this is a continuity between American administrations over the last decade of gradual withdrawal from the Middle East and a disengagement from the Middle East. And I think that this is a trend that is not a coincidence with the energy points that you've just made. I think this is a persistent trend. Over the same period, we have had the rise of great power competition. Cliff Cuption, I think, made a very good point in one of yesterday's panels that the United States, in terms of brute power, we could still see this as a unipolar world. I don't actually agree with that. I think in terms of the dynamics of how power works, we are already in a multipolar world, and more so. Moreover, if you look at the two great revisionist powers, challenger and revisionist powers, Russia and China, what we're seeing and have been seeing over the last few years is kind of reverse Nixon. Nixon, of course, famously detached China from Russia, from the Soviet Union. Well, nowadays we're seeing Russia and China being pushed very, very close together. And I believe the midterm results from last week are going to increase the heat on Russia from a Democratic Congress, and they're going to accelerate that reverse Nixon trend. So what implications does this have for geopolitics in the Gulf? Russia's role is really interesting. I think a lot of people in Washington see Putin as purely an opportunist, which he is. He exploits the West's weaknesses. He exploits gaps, geopolitical, entrepreneurial opportunities, such as the one in Syria 4 years ago. And that is very true, but I think he's more than just an opportunist. I think Russia is playing a longer game, and I think you see that manifest here in the Gulf. You see Russia investing in nuclear power, civil nuclear power, in Saudi Arabia, in India, and in other countries. These aren't sort of 3 to 6 months projects. These are long-term strategic Russian investments. You see Russia spreading way beyond its intervention in Syria and its relationship with Iran in terms of building quite strong ties in the Gulf region with the United Arab Emirates, of course. There's a $2 billion arms agreement that was signed last year. You have Russian-UAE cooperation in building a Red Sea port in Eritrea, quite possibly. You see the UAE, of course, in Somaliland, and Russia now nibbling at that. You see what they call a Russian pivot to Africa. And I think that the implications, of Russia's longer-term, far more strategic intervention, it's opportunistic, but it's a strategic one too. The implications for politics here are very, very interesting. It's fascinating the degree to which the Saudis have developed close ties with the Russians as well as the Emiratis. It's fascinating the degree to which Netanyahu and Israel are developing close relations with Russia. Bibi has been to Moscow more times since Trump was elected than he's been to Washington. Then you get China. And the China role is more subtle, but I think ultimately is more important than Russia's role. It should be noted, something I just learned this morning, that China has stopped importing US crude oil in retaliation for the sanctions. I hadn't realized that a quarter of US crude oil exports go to China. China has stopped them as part of the trade war. But in terms of the reverse Nixon, the larger picture, I think what we're going to see is an acceleration of that under a divided government in Washington. I think that we're going to see, as many participants in the Bloomberg conference in Singapore last week pointed out, including Dr. Kissinger and Hank Paulson, we're going to see a continued divergence between China and the US. Paulson very memorably, Hank Paulson, who's a great friend of China, Hank Paulson very memorably said, a new economic iron curtain is coming down between the United States and America, between China and the United States. So the biggest sort of geopolitical picture here is, I think, has extraordinarily far-reaching implications for how Gulf foreign relations are going to develop in the years ahead. And I haven't got into, you know, divisions within the GCC and Qatar and stuff like that, partly because I'm just not qualified to, but partly because there isn't the time. So let's get into climate change a little bit later if we can.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا. هذه فعلا تحولات يعني مهمة، ولكن يعني لنأخذ يعني إضافة معينة تتعلق بالطاقة المتجددة. ومعروف أن يعني الوكالة الدولية للطاقة المتجددة مقرها هون في أبو ظبي. فحصتها الآن كطاقة متجددة في ميزان الطاقة العالمي 11%. يتوقع أن تصل إلى 12.5% في 2023. الإمارات تساهم الآن يعني في الدول المتقدمة والنامية على يعني بنفس المستوى في إقامة يعني مراكز ومحطات للطاقة المتجددة مثل مصفوفة لندن والطاقة الشمسية في إسبانيا وفي العديد من الدول الأفريقية. ما انعكاس ذلك على موقع دولة الإمارات في المستقبل يعني؟
This is directed at me?
Yes.
So IRENA, the fact that IRENA is based here is, I think, hugely significant. UAE has been making, as Saudi has, investments in renewable technologies in the last few years. I think the IPCC report that came out a few weeks ago, a really very alarming report in terms of what we now know that we didn't know from the last IPCC report, that we have to prevent the global temperatures rising by more than 1.5 degrees, we have to reduce fossil fuel carbon emissions by 45% by 2030. So basically, by half within a little bit more than a decade, an extraordinarily tall order. And if we don't pull that off, which I think is probably safe to assume that we won't on current course, then we're going to be moving into the 2-degree range towards the end of the century. And the Gulf is on the front line of the effects of that. And we've seen in recent years extraordinary rises in heat, extreme heat in this region and in Pakistan, Iran, and other countries in the area, and extraordinary sort of spikes in mortality rates during the summer heat. So we're going to have to expect more of that, and the Gulf states and its neighbors are going to have to plan better for it. I've got a bias towards the UAE's ability to look to the future. I've been coming here for almost 30 years, and I have longer familial ties with the region, and I've seen this extraordinary dynamism of the United Arab Emirates sort of mushrooming from the Trucial states into this modern Arab country. And so I don't underestimate the Emirati ability to adapt and be dynamic in terms of facing even a challenge as extraordinary as this. But it's going to have to be an extraordinary response. I do think, and to pick up a point you were making, I do think that, as the principal sort of OPEC region and an energy oil exporting region of the world, the Gulf states have an ability here to demonstrate not just practical leadership in their own interests, because you are on the front line of climate change, but moral leadership in terms of demonstrating that even the most addicted oil addicts can wean themselves off that addiction. So, I mean, these are tall challenges, but as I say, I have great faith in the UAE's ability to be dynamic.
Thank you. نفتح الآن باب الأسئلة لدي العديد من طلبات الأسئلة، ولكن أبدأ من وديه. عودة. تفضل.
My question is to the three of you. Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You know, as technology advances, it's going to have an impact on the cost of energy. And as alternative energy sources increase, the dependence on this region is going to decline. Can any of you comment on the impact of that on Iran oil exports 15 years from now?
On what? Sorry?
On Iranian oil exports.
شور. المتحدث الآخر دكتور سعد. أيمن.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. I thank the panelists for their interesting presentations, and I draw your attention to the growing concept of energy transition. Here we talk about transition from conventional to non-conventional energy capabilities, allowing countries like Russia to become a multifaceted, a country of multifaceted capabilities, not only powerful in terms of gas and oil production, but also in terms of nuclear energy production throughout the so-called gigantic contractor Rosatom. And here I would like to mention that for a country of limited resources like my country, like Jordan, nuclear energy comes on a very high level of priority. Question is to the panelists. Question is, how do you justify all rich countries like United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia diverting into nuclear energy production? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. David.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Dave Pollack from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I would like to question the assertion that because of American energy independence, the United States is actually withdrawing from the Middle East. I understand the larger trends that were pointed out, but I still would argue that despite the desire of President Obama and President Trump to be done with interventions, especially military interventions and conflicts in the region, both presidents have decided to actually maintain a small but significant American military presence in Iraq, and even to introduce and maintain the first ever American military presence in Syria, and under the Trump administration to ramp up the American declared policy, at least, of confronting Iran throughout the region. And I think to begin to take some serious practical steps to put that policy into effect. Now that, you might say, is a temporary phenomenon, and perhaps it is, but I do think that the larger trends that you yourself, and I guess these comments are addressed to Mr. Luce, the trends that you yourself signaled about increasing Russian and Chinese intervention or involvement in the Middle East might, in and of themselves, also produce an American reaction in order to balance or counter that, and to maintain an American presence and an American influence and American protection for our friends and allies in the region. So I don't think that there is such a single factor, linear connection between reduced American energy dependence and this claimed American withdrawal from the Middle East that I think is more illusion than fact. Thank you.
شكرا. Sayyid Yasser. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. The focus in this panel was on the oil and gas, but there is also a tendency in the world to shift towards the renewable energy and solar energy especially. And by coincidence, the present oil-rich countries, oil-exporting countries, are also countries that can benefit from the solar energy almost indefinitely and until the eternity, perhaps. What are the chances of shifting for the present oil-exporting countries to turn to the solar energy and keep their oil under the soil and perhaps make the solar energy perhaps cheaper and go until the eternity? This is a question that I want to address to Mr. Luce.
شكرا. بقى لنا القليل من الوقت وصراحة نخاف من دكتور ابتسام يعني، لذلك بعطي آخر سؤال حق الدكتور سعد. خلاص. اوكي ننتقل اذا نعطي المجال حق الشخص متحدث آخر زان. خلاص.
Four questions we have.
ها؟ No more question. اوكي. إذا بعطي الكلمة لكل متحدث للرد أو إذا عنده أي إضافة أخرى، وهذه المرة سوف أبدأ من هناك من إدوارد.
So I think there were two questions addressed to me. I'll start with the last one, which is easiest for me to answer, namely that I'm not really qualified to answer it. It's a very, very good question. Leaving the oil in the ground and developing other technologies such as solar and nuclear. I mean, it is worth stressing that the cost of renewable energy keeps falling. Solar energy production is considerably lower than it was even 3 years ago, and it continues to fall. And there is a lot of sunshine around here. So I would imagine that that would be an increasingly viable alternative. But to get to the other question that was addressed to me by the gentleman from the Washington Institute for the Near East. So you might be right, and I hope you're right, that the United States' withdrawal or apparent withdrawal isn't going to continue in a linear fashion to become a complete withdrawal. And you're also right that it isn't entirely to do with America's energy independence. There are other factors here, such as America's domestic political exhaustion with intervention in wars of choice and otherwise. And that's something Obama and Trump have both picked up on in their different ways. I hope that America will get back to, in a multipolar world, because I do believe we're in that, we'll get back to the kind of longer-term strategic foreign policy that we have seen over the last 7 decades when America has been at its best. I don't know what events, though, are going to provoke America into re-engaging with the region. The only ones I can think of are the wrong ones, such as conflict with Iran. And we should all be careful what we wish for. I've noticed there is quite a sort of Iran hawkishness here. I really hope there isn't another war coming.
شكرا. دكتور مراد.
Yeah. Okay, let me just try to address these 4 questions I noted down. So in reverse order, the last question by, I believe, Yashar Yakis, what scope for oil-producing countries to switch more to solar and to keep oil sort of under the ground? This is actually a very good question, and I travel quite a bit to oil and gas producing countries and sunny countries, Uzbekistan, Iran, 2 examples, as well as, of course, UAE, this region here in the Gulf. There's a great deal of interest at the moment in all of these countries in exploiting new technologies to actually allow them to move towards renewable energy, and solar and wind are actually the 2 fastest growing forms of renewable energy at the moment at a global level, and solar is very popular. This question very much depends on government policy, and particularly the type of support schemes that governments introduce in order to allow energy production to come from solar as a source. There's a great deal of interest in it. However, the experience shows that these support schemes can be very tricky. So I'll give you one example. Spain in the European Union introduced various subsidies, or not subsidies, actually feed-in tariffs. They're a form of subsidies in order to incentivize investments into solar. Around about 2011, 2012, Spain introduced these sort of incentives, and they were based on guidelines from the European Union, European Commission in Brussels. So this actually attracted quite a few billion euros worth of investment into PV, into solar in Spain. So this was very good. Electricity generation started coming from solar in Spain. Portugal also had a similar experience, as did a number of EU countries. But what you then had was that the Spanish government, we had a change of government in Spain in 2012, and the new government kind of came into a small fiscal crisis. They had a budgetary dilemma, and then they woke up to themselves and they realized that investors all of a sudden have this gravy train, and they over-incentivized, in fact. So they actually removed some of these support schemes, and that created a lot of disputes. And in fact, the government of Spain is facing something like 33 major arbitration claims against it because of the way that it changed the guidelines and the support schemes for investors. So this is a really key case study for countries that are interested in solar, that if you're going to introduce support schemes, and normally you have to, because the type of technologies that we use in renewable energy, Edward is perfectly right when he's saying that costs of renewables are coming down, but still renewables are not an Adam Smith style market. It's not a perfect market. It's still a lot of government intervention in renewable, because it's still in an infant industry, let's say, compared to fossil fuels. So the type of support schemes that will be introduced in this region, I think, will be critical. Countries like Uzbekistan, Iran, they have a huge comparative advantage in solar, but they have absolutely no clue about how to implement support schemes and to attract the type of technology partners, investors that can help them develop. So I think in the short term, we're not going to see solar catch on as much as we would like to in new regions. But in regions like Europe, it's very much dependent on support schemes, and because of these disputes in Spain, also Italy, there's a lot of debate about how to move forward with this. Just very briefly on some of the other questions, if I may. US energy independence, I really dislike this term energy independence. It's a kind of Nixon-era terminology, and where really we've moved on from that. US is, whether it's withdrawing from the Gulf, we can debate this. Personally, I don't really think so in this context, certainly not being replaced by Russia at a strategic level. But US is not entirely energy independent. I mean, at the moment, if you actually look at what the US is doing with its gas industry and the fact that it's actually building these new, liquefaction terminals in the Gulf of Mexico, and a lot of this is actually geared towards the increased liquidity and increased globalization of the gas markets. So US is actually going to become more and more part of this game and more dependent on, international trends in the gas market. So we're actually moving away from energy independence, I would argue, in the US, even though it's kind of more autonomous in terms of satisfaction of demand. And just very briefly on nuclear and on Iran as two separate points. Someone asked about justification of nuclear energy. I must say that in terms of energy transition, there's a big lobby out there in support of the nuclear energy industry. There is a big noise being made that actually nuclear energy is clean. Nuclear is, it doesn't, emit greenhouse gases. It's not a coal. It's not a dirty sort of fuel. The big debate about nuclear, of course, is safety. It's not about security of supply or about its, level of purity in terms of the carbon emissions, but it's more about safety. So in Europe, there's a big debate about nuclear. Countries like France are hugely dependent on nuclear for electricity generation.
Thank you.
And in countries like Jordan, Middle East, it's going to catch on. Russia is a country that has very substantial experience with nuclear. And Iran, just final word, it's just Iran, it's going to be very much a question of global demand. Geopolitics to some degree as well. Iran will redirect its oil exports elsewhere, but it's really going to be a question of demand. I could go on.
شكرا. نختتم الجلسة بالكلمة الأخيرة للدكتور هاني. دكتور بس يعني رجاء بالإضافة للأسئلة اللي عندك، يعني في موضوع يمكن يهم يعني دول المنطقة، يعني الشيل أويل أو الغاز الصخري، يعني التكلفة نزلت من $80 للبرميل إلى 30 الآن. فتقنيا يعني بما أنك متخصص، إلى أي مدى يعني ممكن هذا السعر ينزل؟ شكرا.
Okay, so thank you very much, and I will be very brief. On Arda's question about the impact of changes in the energy industry on Iranian oil exports. Iranian oil industry is beset and constrained by the fact that Iran consumes 50% of all the oil it produces. So their exports are not only constrained by external factors such as embargoes and others, but it is basically limited to how much they can produce. And the only way they can expand their production is to increase exploration and upgrading of their wells, for which they do not currently have the capital to do it. So as far as the eye can see, Iran has a fairly limited capacity to increase its oil exports in any significant way. I should add, while I'm saying that the region itself has very similar constraints, particularly in Saudi Arabia, the largest oil producer. Saudi Arabia consumes about 36% of all the oil it produces. So when they talk about 10 million barrels of production a year, they're only selling about 6.4 million. That local consumption is growing, and therefore it doesn't take a doctorate in math to realize that over a course of 20 years, they can produce all they can, but they won't be exporting very much, and that's one of the big challenges in the region. On the issue of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, I'm not a political expert, but I will give you a number that might tell you where the U.S. priorities and U.S. interests are. Demographers and economists estimate that by the year 2050, 32 years from now, 70% to 75% of the world GDP and 70% of the entire world population will be residing in Asia. So you see where the risks and the balance of risks and opportunities are, and you see where U.S. priorities are going to be. One comment about the issue of renewable energy and fossil fuel. When I say the demand for fossil fuel and the death or the near death of the internal combustion engine, I'm not suggesting at all that this is bad news for the region. There's huge opportunity to use material that includes oil and fossil fuel into components of production that will be far more value added and far more potentially more beneficial to the region. All of us who travel have experienced traveling in what the Boeing called this Dreamliner, the 787. Something very special about this airplane, it has no metal component whatsoever. It's all made out of composite material, mostly from fiber and fossil fuel. So there's huge opportunity to invest in material science and material technology. And I have to tell you that of the academic work that I have seen in the region, the UAE, no surprise, is leading in this area in some of its universities. You asked me about the shale. So the revolution in the United States really entailed two major techniques. One is the ability to reach shale formations that are very hard, almost as hard as diamond, that are about 1 mile to 1.5 miles underground. We all knew about these reservoirs, but we didn't know how to reach them. We didn't know how to reach them from an engineering standpoint. We didn't know how to reach them from a cost standpoint. And we also had environmental constraints about how to use them. Having cracked that, literally and figuratively, we were able to reach into reservoirs that were hitherto unavailable to the region. The second innovation was really in horizontal drilling. Horizontal drilling is basically drilling a well, as historically has been the case, but able to extend it horizontally, that allowed producers to produce basically 4 to 6 times the same amount of oil from the same well that we did historically. So that, in a sense, is the major revolutionary change that has taken place over the course of that time. Finally, on the issue of the returning the issue of U.S. involvement in the region, you know, we're all looking and seeing what's happening, friction between the U.S. and China. A lot of it is focused on trade, but there is a hidden agenda beyond that, and that is what is called the Thucydides dilemma, rising power challenging a sitting power. And the U.S. is trying to figure out its strategic approach to this thing. This is going to continue to challenge the region. I was just in China last week and found out, not so much to my surprise, but something different. And that is China is looking to find ways to balance its trade with the United States. And ask the United States, what do you have to sell us? And oddly enough, natural gas and oil were the major deals in which the United States is beginning to approach China with that to reduce the trade deficit. So suddenly the United States, as a major oil producer, is competing directly, both in oil and gas, with China. So the fact that we're selling oil and probably will be selling more gas will be no surprise.
شكرا دكتور. بذلك نحن نختتم على الوقت المحدد. وشكرا دكتور هاني، شكرا دكتور مرات، وشكرا سيد إدوارد، وشكرا للحضور جميعا. ننتقل إلى الجلسة الأخرى.
شكرا دكتور محمد.
The next panel starts now. The next panel starts now.